Today, in episode number 103, we continue our discussion on being working moms and homemakers. And I think working women, along with busy moms everywhere, will gain life-giving insights in this episode on rejecting hustle culture and creating a home that you and your family love. So listen in. Hey friend, do you desire to connect with God in real and tangible ways? Do you struggle with the reality that life just hasn't gone the way you imagined it would? Well, you have come to the right place, and you're not alone. I'm Shelly Sneed, the host of Unperfect, and it's my weekly mission to inspire women like you and me to grow spiritually through authentic stories rooted in the truth of God's Word. Hope and probably some humor are coming up. I think you mentioned in the book that the men want to take care of the family, but we kind of have more of this nurturing part of us. So even when we're working, we're trying to think of more, how do I also balance all the other things, where, I'm not going to say it's easier for them, but that's just not something that they're typically wired to be thinking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do think that men are able to oftentimes compartmentalize a little bit more.
Yes.
When they're at work, they're at work. When they're at home, they're at home. Whereas I've seen images where, a woman's brain or thought process is more like the spaghetti noodles and they're all intertwined. And, even as you're at work, you're taking the phone call about the update from the doctor, or you're getting the email about the field trip. And it is I don't think you can completely compartmentalize those two as the mom. And I don't think that is a bad thing, but I think it does kind of require us to think about, okay, have I created both of these areas in ways that can blend with each other?
Yeah.
Because if we're trying to keep them totally separate, it's going to be really frustrating when we find out they're bleeding into one another.
Yeah. And I love you keep using the word harmonize. That is really a great way to talk about the way those mesh. Okay, I just have to say this. My mother and I were talking about this yesterday. I don't know if you're familiar with the comedian Nate Bargatze.
Yes, okay. I got to see him last summer.
Did you? Okay, my husband and I saw him last year. We love him, but he has this thing he does about how why do the schools even call the dad? Like, he got a call from his kid's school, and he's like, why did you call the dad? Like, the mom knows everything. Why did you call the dad? I don't even know what school my kid goes to. Why would you call the dad? Which he's exaggerating, but I just thought that's so funny. That's so true. The mom tends to have all these things. Well, that kind of brings us to this next question that I want to ask you about. Because along with busyness, I think especially here in our Western culture, we sadly have opted into this whole hustle culture, which we've kind of talked about. But then we go and try to justify all this busyness with this extravagant vacation to make up for lost family time. And I love one of the things you talk about are some different ways that we can combat this and really invest in our relationships with each other and our family on like an everyday scale. So could you talk to us a little bit about that and maybe some ways that we can do that?
Yeah, I really, in that chapter, I was trying to emphasize this fact that I think our goal should be a life that we don't have to escape from.
Oh.
And so vacations are beautiful, and they can be these moments to pause and to reset or to recharge. But unfortunately, in a hustle culture, it is becoming more and more common to just feel like we just, we have to escape from it for a while, or there's no way to keep going, or to kind of rationalize the lack of time that families are spending together and say, well, we'll make up for it when we have this week together. And instead, I think if we think about building in these regular check-ins, these regular experiences that don't have to be extravagant, they can happen locally, that is really going to be more meaningful in the long run, rather than say, okay, we'll spend this quality time together for a week, once a year. Well, instead, let's spend quality time together once a week. And maybe it's taking a bike ride, or maybe we're having a family game night. But rather than thinking that, we have to have this big push to what we're seeing on social media,
Sure.
this is the thing, this is the way that families bond, which is also somewhat ironic when oftentimes to afford those elaborate trips, it requires putting in overtime or spending more time away from each other. So it's
Right.
like, well, in order to have family time, we have to forego family time. And again, everybody's financial situation is different. People, they don't have to make those choices in order to make it happen. But if we do, kind of thinning that narrative a little bit to say, okay, we can actually have these experiences locally, we can have them simplistically, and it's still going to accomplish that end goal that the vacation is supposed to.
Yeah, I love that. And just that phrase that you said, a life that we don't have to escape from. And in some ways, I'm kind of glad that early on when my kids were younger, we didn't have a lot of income that we could do extravagant things with, because I do think it made us more creative, where we're bike rides and we're looking for the free stuff to do around town, and we're looking, zoos and all the things. We love family game night. Like, in fact, our kids are getting some of them to where we have to force them to do it, but they always have fun when we do it. But
they're glad you forced them.
Yes, they're glad. They won't admit it, but they are. But I love that, because also that is a true relationship, or that's a truer experience than snorkeling on an ocean off the coast of Mexico or whatever. That's a one-time thing, but can we enjoy each other on a daily basis and find things that interest us together that are just normal everyday things? I think that's so important. I love that.
And one thing I've really become a big fan of is kind of that in between. Maybe it's not a completely simple board game night, but it's not this extravagant vacation, and that is staycations. And,
Yeah.
We took one this winter, and it's finding somewhere to get away for a night or two in your own town, or in somewhere that, doesn't require a road trip. And then it can still feel really purposeful. We paused. Maybe we did budget some money toward this. It gets us out of our normal environment, but it certainly doesn't have to break the bank.
Right.
And my kids, they remember the staycations almost like it was a road trip that we took to the beach or the mountains, something like that, because we hyped it up, and
Sure.
they packed their suitcase for it.
Oh, that's fun.
And so, for a kid, if they're spending the night somewhere else, it does feel kind of like an event. And so I found that to be kind of a middle ground for families that maybe the budget or the schedule doesn't allow for something a week long or far away, but to still make it feel like a milestone or something meaningful and out of the ordinary.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And can we just also say for the moms here, like, how stressful is it for us to leave town? Like, I always
absolutely
just and I don't know about you, but like, I want the house clean when I leave. I'm not the best cleaner on a regular basis, but to me, there's nothing worse than coming home exhausted from a vacation and the house is messy too. So just getting out the door is stressful. So there's another thing for a staycation or staying home. I love that. That's great. So one thing I talk about with a lot of moms that I think a lot of moms struggle with is guilt. I end up talking with a lot of moms about regret, which I think is similar. But I think what's similar about the two is that we're so hard on ourselves as moms, whether it's regretting things we didn't do or we did do, or the guilt from what we're not doing, what our kids aren't getting. Or what we're missing out on or what they're missing out on. And then I think there's an added layer of guilt for Christian moms, because then we also have that spiritual level of, I think I sometimes I forget that I'm not their savior, and everything in their spiritual life is going to be based on whether I did it right or I didn't do it right, or I did this or didn't do this. But I think we probably have some misconceptions about traditional values or what a traditional family entails when it comes to, I guess, feeling the guilt that we sometimes feel as guilt as moms, and especially working moms. And so I would love for you to speak to this and offer some hope to moms who might be suffering from this type of guilt.
Well, going back to what you said, Shelley, about the traditional is oftentimes what we put on a pedestal. I think that is, for me, that is why I struggled being a working mom, is it's not traditional. And so when I delved into the research a little bit, this traditional idea of a homemaker that most of us have in mind, where the mom stays home with the kids while the dad goes and works, that really came about during the Industrial Revolution, when men started leaving the farms or small businesses that they had at home and working in the factory or working in the city. That historically, for most of history, we've seen that the moms and the dads kind of worked together in this enterprise at home that encompassed how they were making their living and also kind of raising the children together. And so, in some ways, that was freeing to me, this idea that, okay, we do want to think about what is biblical. But when we sometimes conflate biblical with a actually modernized version of traditional, then that's not overly helpful. And we actually can see in the Bible examples of women like the Proverbs 31 woman who was employed in some form of money-making activities for her family. And we see that in the New Testament as well with Lydia, the seller of purple cloth, that she had a family, and yet she also was involved in employment and was able to actually use some of her resources to help with furthering the early church. And so I don't think that's to say it makes it right or wrong, as long as we say it's not going against the biblical mandate. But that idea, traditional is always best. When we're looking at a tradition that has only spanned the last, 100, 150 years, we're not really getting the full picture there. And so I think looking at kind of more, what are the values that traditionally have been endorsed of parents having their hearts turned toward their children and having their hearts turned toward the Lord? That would be something, of course, to keep front and center. But that doesn't mean it's always going to happen in only one model, which would be the mom being home full time. So I have found freedom in that, and that has freed me from guilt just based on, does my life look exactly the way that this model that I've put on a pedestal looks?
Sure. Yeah, and I love that. It's making the distinctions between the values I want to have, not necessarily the model that it has to look like. And interestingly, I hadn't thought about this when I was reading your book, but as you were speaking just now, I was doing a Bible study last year with some ladies, and it was all about women in the Bible, but the author was really good about giving you cultural context for all of these things. And one of the biggest things was that the working environment in biblical culture, particularly in the Old Testament, I guess it went through the New Testament too, the work revolved around the home and the whole family was involved. So, even that culture when the Bible was being written was very different than what it looks like today. So I think that's important. And you mentioned some women that we can look at who were doing things different than we might have that when we think of traditional. But it probably looked very different than we even think it looked in biblical times. So I love that you talked about just making sure that our values are we making time for what we value, and are we showing up where we think we need to show up as far as what our values will reflect, rather than, well, my mom and my grandmom, or this is how they did it, or how I was taught this way in church. Well, one of the things that you talk about in the book also a lot, and I hope we're not giving away too much. We aren't. Y'all still need to go buy this book. It's great. But thank you for being willing to share a lot of this on the podcast.
Oh, I'm happy to.
Yeah, you talk about the need to view ourselves as educators in our kids' lives, which this is really, really insightful chapter. So share a little bit of your heart on this topic, how you've been able to educate your kids in the things that are going to matter really in their lives as they age and mature.
Well, as I was sort of figuring out the type of family that we were going to be, was I going to keep working? Was I going to stay home? One thing that I kept coming back to is that I didn't want to outsource my role as a parent. I didn't want to outsource my role as their mom. And so it was kind of thinking about how can I be purposeful, even as we are choosing to be a part of this village and have other people disciple our children and come alongside our children. I still want to see me as their mom and their dad, as we are kind of these primary influencers and even teachers for our kids. And I'm not homeschooling them, and so it's not all academic. Though I certainly think there are things we can do with, supporting what's happening at school and cultivating reading and all of that. But really, what are some of the soft skills that really should be in the jurisdiction of the home? And there's been some interesting discussions about things that schools aren't teaching kids
Sure.
anymore. They're not teaching them manners. They're not teaching them how to balance their checkbook. They're not so on and so forth. And to be honest, I don't get too worked up about those things because I want my kids' teachers to be qualified to teach them academically, but I am happy to fill in the gap everywhere else. And I actually feel like that should be my role.
Right.
That I should be the one teaching them how to look someone else in the eye when they talk to them, how to show empathy to another person, how to answer the phone, whatever it is. And I don't think a lot of parents disagree with that, but I do think that if we're so busy just running from one place to the next, that those things fall through the cracks because it's not going to show up on a test or it's not going to be part of the group activity that they're involved with. And so, really, I think being their teacher, it has to coincide with, do we have downtime? Do we have margin in order to invite them into the kitchen with us while we're prepping for dinner so that they can learn how to crack an egg and scramble it on the stove, or as they get older, change a tire or whatever those things might be.
Yeah, that is so true. And I was thinking as you said that too, we also have to know our kids and know who's deficient in this, not the school things, but like, oh, this kid is really struggling with their self-esteem, or this kid is dealing with this. I need to know my kids well to know how I need to instruct them more in that. The other nice thing about us teaching them these soft skills, as you are mentioning them, is that we're coming from a biblical view of how Christ wants us to show up in this situation. I have a child who has struggled with some bullying, and yes, the school can handle that, but on my end, we can talk about, as believers, how do we need to show up in that situation and how do we need to respond. So I love that. We did for each of our kids when they first got, I'm just throwing this out there for the mamas listening that might be in this boat, when they were old enough to drive, so they started having like a checking account. I don't even know if, my kids don't even know what a checkbook is, but I still call it a checking
Most
account.
Probably don't at this point.
Debit account, I guess that's a better word. But we made them download the app for, or if they use it on their laptop if they don't have a smartphone, because that's a whole nother thing. But we're all about waiting as long as possible before they have that in their hand. But they had to learn how to use the app, Every Dollar, the Dave Ramsey app. And there's, I'm sure there's other good ones, but just teaching them how to budget and teaching them how to think through purchases. And even then, my husband sat down recently. I thought this was genius, and I think he got it off an old episode of The Cosby Show. But he sat down with our three kids who were still at home. They were at the time 17, 18, and 19, and they were working some part-time jobs, and just maybe not really realizing what like a work week entails and what the cost of everything entails. And so he did the whole, I'm going to hand you what you're making for a month in Monopoly money, but then I'm going to show you what it costs to pay for your insurance and your internet and your everything. And so literally 2 of them were completely broke by the time they paid all their bills in the Monopoly money. One of them had like $20 left, and one of them had like a couple hundred, like, because he was making more than the others. But anyway, it was just a fun way. And that kind of covers several of the things that you mentioned in your book, because my husband did it. So it was a fun thing for him to be actively involved in and teaching them, but then just showing them these real life, this is what it looks like, and kind of made it a game. But you use the word purposeful, and I think that's the key. I think our kids aren't going to learn these things on accident. And we hear that. I know intentionality is such a big buzzword, but it's so true that if I'm not intentional about making sure they come away with the values, or even just how to do their laundry or whatever, if I'm not intentional about these things, it's not going to just happen on their own. And again, that goes back to the whole, do we have time to sit down? It's a lot easier to do things for our kids. It takes a lot less time than to teach them, right? And I think you even mentioned that, in the book, about it'd be so much easier if I just did all their laundry and I did this, and, even teaching them to cook. And
right. But I will say, I think there becomes a point, and we're not far enough along. I don't have teenagers yet, but if parents put in that work on the initial side, then eventually the kids can step in, and someday some of those tasks can be taken off mom's plate. And so thinking about homemaking, we've talked about, what's the role of dads, but even as kids mature, what is their role in their family? To see that, it's not just to be taken care of, even though, of course, it is our job to take care of them, but also giving them some ownership. And I think that even extends thinking about homemaking, not just the home we are giving them someday, but the tools we are giving them to take into the homes they're going to create with their future families someday, in ways that they don't just have to, through trial and error, figure it all out, but they can have this level of competency to really start off on a strong footing when they're creating their own homes.
Absolutely. Because marriage is hard enough and parenting is hard enough than it will be when you add the other deficiencies that many of us probably went into marriage with. I don't think I learned how to budget until about 15 years, 20 years into our marriage. And boy, we could have saved a lot of heartache. But yes, absolutely. One of my favorite things, my daughter is at a community college now. She's my youngest, but she will text me now and say, "Can you buy all these ingredients? I've found a new recipe I want to make, but and I'm like, yes, because I don't have to cook. You're doing something so productive that's going to be so helpful, and ownership. She found the recipe herself and she's doing it. So that definitely can end up helping the mom as much as it helps the kid, as you said, when they get a little older. Well, I would just love close with this question. A lot of the women that listen to my podcast are struggling with hard things, whether it's just trying to figure out how to thrive in this now and the not yet that 1 John 3:2 talks about. That we want to fully live the lives that we've been given, right? But I just wonder if you have one piece of advice, or maybe a word from scripture, or something that you could leave with the women that are listening today, in addition to what you shared. What encouragement could you share today?
Well, I do love the verse that says, "Don't be weary in well-doing, for in good season we'll reap if we don't lose heart." And I think it is so easy to become weary because we don't have kind of a set finish line at the end of a day, perhaps the way that if we're just thinking quantifiably, like a task in the workforce, that project's done.
Right.
But there's many things about homemaking that are habitual. They're cyclical. There will always be more dishes to wash. There will always be more feelings to attend to, which is also the beauty of it. And I think weariness, when it says don't become weary in well-doing, weariness is not quite the same thing as just tiredness from having done a job well and needing a good night's sleep.
Right.
And so I guess just kind of recognizing that in order to not be weary, it is trying to find those ways to fill our cup. Certainly looking to scripture, looking to other women who can validate and support us, or maybe redirect us if that's ever necessary. But it can be easy sometimes to feel like, okay, nobody's seeing what I'm doing here.
Right.
It doesn't matter. Nobody else is noticing. But if you're doing well in God's eyes, then it does matter. And that weariness is something that He does provide rest and solace for us if we, if we're willing to accept that.
I love that. Yeah. And it is so true. I always say, like, moms don't get a break. Like, we don't get a day off. I've been working really intentionally about Sabbathing, and even with older kids, like it's very hard to turn off the being a mom. I think that's where that weariness comes in, probably, that you're talking about. So yeah, that's huge. I think community is really big. You mentioned that too, with other people. I know for so long I felt like I am alone. No one else is experiencing what I'm experiencing for whatever the reason. And I've found that's never true. I just need to find my people. I need to be willing to be vulnerable to other people so that they will be vulnerable in return and be like, no, that's what we're experiencing too. Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, Charity, thank you so much for being here, for all that you've shared. I am going to encourage my listeners to go get this book. I'll put a link in the show notes because there are so many more wonderful nuggets, and again, just the biblical things that you bring in, as well as the research and the practical strategies. It's all so, so good. But in the meantime, where can my listeners find and connect with you?
Well, thank you, Shelley, for asking. I do have a website, charitygibson.com, and I've got a monthly blog there and an email list, as well as information about me and the book. Amazon is also a great place to find it. And something that I'm pretty excited about, I just released an audiobook that I was blessed to be able to read. So if some of the moms out there, they're like, I don't have time to sit down and read a book, you can take it with you and listen while you're doing chores or exercising or whatever the case might be.
I love it. And my favorite audiobooks are where the author reads it. So that's awesome. You just feel like you're hearing, they're sitting with you over coffee or while you're driving and telling you these wonderful things.
I agree. I love hearing a book read by the author.
Yes. Well, I will put all of those things in the linked in the that will be in the show notes. But again, thank you for taking your time to share with us here on Unperfect. All right, ladies, I know this 2-part series has inspired you or challenged you in some way, and I want you to take just a moment to think about how you might need to reflect on the truths that Charity shared with us, or maybe even some things you might want to put into practice. I do not recommend going crazy and trying to implement everything you've just heard all at once, because if you're like me, that would be very overwhelming. But maybe just pick one you can go with this week. Like maybe it's time to say no to something that is stealing away connections you could be making with your family. Find a blank spot on your family calendar this week and protect it to the death, okay? Maybe you want to come up with a new family tradition or rhythm this week that will help you build on the relationships within your family. So go have fun, be creative, and put that in. Maybe the work you need to do this week is heart work, like giving your guilt of past mistakes or poor prioritizing over to God and just practice resting in His grace. In Philippians 3:13 and 14, we are called to forget the things that are behind us and take the next step toward the goal of our calling in Jesus. So I challenge you to do that if you need to do that this week. Or maybe you've noticed a skill or a spiritual discipline or a character trait that you can commit to helping your child learn this week. Cooking, budgeting, forgiveness, work ethic, patience. I mean, you know your kid and you know something that would be beneficial for them or something at this season in their life that they need to learn, that you are the most important educator in their life to teach them that. And I know what you're thinking, God should have picked somebody else, or maybe that's just me, like putting my story on you, because I'm usually thinking, God, you should have picked somebody else. I can't do this. So if that's you, head back to episode number 95. My guest, Jessica Ronnie, had a powerful word on that. So the link's in the show notes. So choose a next step and walk in it this week, my friend. And go grab Charity's book. The link to it and to sign up for her once-a-month newsletter will be a valuable and encouraging resource for you, and that link is in the show notes. As always, I'm praying you're able to see glimpses of glory in the now and the not yet of your unperfect life this week. I'll see you next time.